All right. Um, this is The Grass is Greener on WXRW 104.1 FM in Milwaukee. I am the host of the program, Gary Grass. With me is my co-host, Babette Bruneau.
Hi, we have with us today Jeffrey Sommers, pardon me, I know I can't.
Professor of Political Economy.
Of Political Economy and Public Policy at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, who is currently in Paris, and Professor Dirk, a German professor and filmmaker teaching on sabbatical at the American University in Paris. Welcome.
Delighted to be with you, Gary and Babette.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you.
All right. So every 4 years we hear about the most important election in human history. And there's a number of people are saying right now that maybe this actually was. So I guess my first question is, was this the most important question in our lifetimes?
Well, it's not insignificant in that we have an election in which it appears as though the president has captured both houses of Congress, not to mention having a judiciary that's quite friendly to them, given the number of Supreme Court appointments and just appointments of hundreds of federal judges as well in the last term that Trump had. So it's not insignificant. But of course, there's been a lot of drama over the past 8 years with Donald Trump. And so there is a tendency sometimes to have some hyperbole, but nonetheless, we also seem to be in what could be a phase change in American politics and perhaps global political economy. I'll stop there. If Dirk has anything to say, he can now.
I mean, from a European perspective, the election of Barack Obama was also considered to be very significant, and Obama continues to be extremely popular here. So in some ways or the other, the impact of the first Obama presidential election was also quite huge here. The first Trump election was also quite a big shock. I think these kind of questions can be probably only answered after the fact.
Yeah, but I think we do have somewhat of a different situation in that Trump, presumably, at least him and or his staff have learned something from the failures of their first administration, and they failed to implement in any significant way any kind of an agenda. I think now they're prepared to move forward quickly with implementing a program. So we'll see. We'll see how that turns out. I mean, to my mind, contra the almost always sage words of my good friend Dirk, I did not see the election of Obama, neither at the time nor presently, as that consequential. I think Dirk is correct, however, just in my estimation, in terms of seeing how publics in various places around the world, including Europe, saw it as significant. But I just didn't happen to see it as such.
I think it was significant, or at least it seemed to have a significant reaction here, even if you just take into account the reaction. I think if we didn't have Obama, we wouldn't have had Trump. I think that the kind of the backlash that we got from it.
There's some element of that. But I will say this, Dirk and I, during the autumn of 2016, when that election was transpiring, we were having a very spirited conversation at a cafe in Princeton, where I was quite enthusiastic about Barack Obama and his prospects for introducing legislative and policy change, and Dirk was not. As it turns out, he was correct. I was wrong in that regard.
No, but I mean, what we have to make a difference probably between what Obama actually did and what kind of like a promise he projected. And I think, I mean, as we all remember, he got immediately the Nobel Peace Prize shortly after becoming American president. And
for doing nothing.
No, for doing nothing. But the expectations were
very high.
They were very high. And I think from if we just take the short moment after the election, it felt very significant. Ultimately, of course, I think Obama has not used the, potential, or even he has not kept the promise he made about like hope for a change. But if we just take this short moment after the election, it felt historically significant. In the end, Obama didn't change too much. And I think maybe that's why we have to be probably careful to now say like, okay, this is the most, I mean, now the Trump 2 is the most significant election. I think we will see what Trump will make out of his mandate.
Right. I misspoke earlier, by the way. I said 2016 when I meant, of course, 2008.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll have to see, just as Dirk says. But I think that unlike Barack Obama, who really did not have a strong vision for what he wanted to do with the country legislatively, Trump and his crew do. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. I mean, as Dirk says,
Yeah, the thing is, crew does. I mean, I think that's one point I make to a lot of people is, they say, well, Trump is lying about his agenda. It's like, well, I don't even know if Trump knows half of what his agenda will wind up being. He just knows his job, the main job of a president is to appoint like 6,000 people shortly after getting into office. And his 6,000 people know what they want to do. And it's the 6,000 people you need to be scared of. And Trump as well. But the other thing is, and this is something you alluded to, and we're talking about like a sort of a phase change in the United States and in the world. That is sort of what I was getting to. I mean, there's a quote from Henry Kissinger was interviewed shortly after Trump's first election, and he said that Trump was one of those figures that arises in history from time to time, which marks the change of an era and kind of strips the old regime of its pretenses. Because Trump is the guy who always says the quiet part out loud. This time around you have the Russian philosopher, nationalist political figure, and scary weirdo Alexander Dugin saying that Trump's election is as big an event as the events of 1917. With the Bolshevik Revolution, and now you've got. I mean, I can list figures like this. I mean, there was just Zhao Lei, just the European point person for the Foreign Ministry of China, just said that this is a pivotal moment, particularly for Europe, where Europe needs to make a decision because this is like one of those crucial points in history, right? The most crucial moment of our time, right? So there is this very broad sense, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, that we are at a huge historical moment here, and Trump is coming along right at the point, sort of representing that moment in some ways. And it may actually be, for those reasons, a really important historical turning point with Trump.
If we would connect it to the bigger idea of the rise of right-wing populism, for sake of a better label, I think obviously he is. I mean, the first Trump election was also seen in connection with the Brexit and all the things that there would be now. I mean, the right-wing populist wave would swipe everything away. It hasn't happened. But then now, in the last couple of years, of course, there has been again a resurgence of right-wing populism. Here in France, where we are now, it's a matter of time before there will be, I think, a president by the Rassemblement National. I mean, in Italy, of course, Meloni is already in power. In Austria, the right-wing populists were kept from power barely, still a process. In Holland, of course, they are in power. So there is basically at the moment definitely like the right-wing populist movement has a momentum. But the question is now, I think the more interesting question would be what will Trump make now out of these 4 years, and whether this can sustain the momentum or if it will revert into a completely opposite direction.
Well, Gary, both complimenting Dirk's remarks and yours, I think that what we see with Trump this time, and also to connect to my first remarks, he does have a administration in waiting that is willing to implement the agenda that they have been discussing with regards to tariff policy. Of course, as you know, they have said there's no place in their administration for figures like Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley, signaling that neocons are not going to have a significant voice or role in their administration, and a few other areas where they have claimed some policy turf while they were campaigning and now seem to be acting on that, suggesting that it wasn't just verbiage, but that it was signaling an intention on policy. Now, of course, I also agree with your earlier remarks regarding Trump and not being a serious figure, but he does have a vague sense of what these people that have attached themselves to this movement want to do. So he can, in this very superficial way, without much depth, speak to almost all these points. And it's not always very coherent. And again, certainly not with any depth
I
or
think it's an
even.
understatement.
Yeah, no, exactly. Sure. But he is aware of it in a vague sort of way. So he seems to agree with what has been presented to him as a direction that the country should go in. I think there are some exaggerations. So, for instance, some people fear uh, some 20 million
Right.
illegal, to use the term that they use, immigrants being driven out of the country. I certainly don't see that. I mean, what we probably will see,
Well,
however, is an administration which is going to act to remove people that they feel have some either criminal past or have no record of work. In other words, the kind of people that, aside from a few people on the left, are not going to make much in the way of protest about. So, in other words, it's going to hold his coalition together, and it's not going to create that many waves. And in fact, I saw a I can't remember her name, but a Latina, a figure of some note in Miami who was speaking to just this issue when confronted by whoever the interviewer on CNN was, suggesting that she should be horrified what Trump was going to do regarding immigrants in the country. And she just shot right back and said, "No, you don't understand. We have a lot of hardworking immigrants in the United States, of course, from Latin America, and they contribute much to the country, but they are not going to be driven out. It's just this one core group of people that are perceived to be, or are, in fact, criminals and or elements that have not been able to insert themselves into the workforce in any kind of meaningful way that will be targeted." So I think whether we like it or not, a move such as that is probably going to result in more support from the public than opposition. So I think we have to, on one level, be careful not to suggest that Trump is going to take some measures, which I don't think he will, because they would be too politically unpopular, while at the same time understand there are other parts of his agenda that actually are quite extreme, and he does intend to carry through with them.
let me just, you have so many things. If you run down like a list of all the things that Trump wants to do and all the things that people, in the Democratic camp have like positioned as like, he's going to do this, he's going to do this, he's going to do this. It's like so many of those things are going to come smack dab confronted with reality and the fact that they are either completely impossible or completely illegal or would have such devastating effects in such a short term that they would not be sustainable for a day. But I mean, there will still be that effort in that direction. There will still be a lot of damage done, right? Even if it doesn't go all the way. I mean, this idea of like, we're going to seal off all the borders and like, build an ocean wall and like have nothing come in or out of the country because it's like, I mean, it's just so ridiculous, right?
Right,
There's going to be people going back and forth constantly. You can't keep people from going back and forth. You wouldn't want to keep people from going back and forth. And this no,
Wreck your own economy.
right. I mean, it's like when he announced, I mean, in the last campaign, a complete ban on all Muslims in the United States, right? Does that mean you're going to kick out American Muslims too? Yes, we'll do it. And it's like, and the Muslim ban was enacted, and it was certain types of visa restrictions for like certain programs for people from 7 different countries, including Venezuela and Chad, and like leaving out Indonesia and like the most enormous Islamic populations there. So like 3% of the world's Muslims were covered and whatever. It was bad, but it was nowhere near the scale of the type of thing that they were talking about. And
Right, sure.
it's going to be the same kind of thing around. It's going to be worse this time, but it still can't even remotely approach and scale the type of stuff that we see in the rhetoric.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right.
My concern is that he will go after Palestinian Americans, those who've come here for study. Students at the various universities who may be protesting, and that the protests themselves will be used as a means to find an excuse to dump people out.
Well, again, we're engaged in speculation right now, but I think that is quite possible. And I have to say, of course, just in terms of my own racket, which is higher education, Trump actually was quite damaging in terms of his visa policies and the impact that had on recruiting international students to our universities. And so he is willing to cross certain lines that actually do harm certain sectors of our economy and society. But he also has a sense, and I think this is from being a couple of decades in reality TV and having some sense of at least what his deplorables think, if we want to call them that, or even just the middle of the country, since he spends a lot of time there and he actually does all these huge rallies. He has this sense of what much of the American people will support and won't support. I think he has a certain instinct for it.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I think Trump has done a good job. When you see like the Democratic nominee coming to one of these rallies, it's the stump speech for the 11,000th time, and it's canned cheers, and sometimes it's a canned audience too. I mean, it's all kind of inside a big bubble.
it's
Whereas
very formulaic. Yeah.
Whereas when Trump goes out and talks, he just kind of riffs and says random crazy stuff and sees what kind of reaction he gets. And he knows when people cheer something and when people don't react or when they don't seem to react positively. And so he has an opportunity to kind of fine tune the stuff in real time by listening to people. Whereas the Democrats go back and they focus group everything and they try to get it like pristine and they wind up sounding completely inauthentic. Whereas Trump, at least sounds real because he says things just, boldly and semi-randomly, just talking out loud, just thinking aloud. Maybe we should do this, yay, okay, yeah, we'll do it then, and then the policy people come back later and say, well, that's impossible. We can't really do that. I'm still going to go with it. I'm still going to say it, right? And I think one of the things that will stop Trump is, if he does things that hurt people in his base, which I mean, some of the stuff is stuff that will like hurt people in his base 4 years after he's gone, but some of the stuff will hurt them quickly, and he'll get the feedback from it and says he's a narcissist and he wants to be loved and he wants big crowds and he wants people to cheer him. He won't stick around with people that like feed him policies that make him unpopular with his base.
Elsa,
Maybe
you're fired.
You're fired.
Yeah.
maybe quickly about the whole question of rhetorics and about Jeff, you said yourself quoting Hillary Clinton, the basket of deplorables and everything. I think too much focus is put on the question of rhetorics. I think, yes, okay, I mean, there might be this entertainment factor, but or this factor like, okay, the guy will now say something unpredictable or interesting, but I don't think that explains the impact of Donald Trump. I think the very idea is that there's probably one part of the audience that is, let's say, a bit entertainment, is craving for entertainment. But I think if we just focus on the rhetorics, then we're ignoring the deeper impact, which is connected. That's why I link it to this, basket of deplorable rhetorics by the Democrats. I think it's not only a question of inauthenticity in rhetorics. I mean, in some ways, on one level, it was explored. I think one German newspaper was juxtaposing Kamala Harris's Vogue cover to Donald Trump's McDonald's kind of PR stunt. And then you see one guy putting some French fries into the whatever. And the other one, so the whole question about this sort of idea of elitism and everything. But I don't think that's just a rhetorical question, or it's not just a question of rhetorics, but it's a question of, in some ways or the other, I think probably most of the Trump voters even know that he's a narcissist, as you quite rightly say. They understand that he's a millionaire who deep down inside probably is not going to defend their interests. But I think what they see is that he's someone who has the capacity to put this Washington system to blow it into pieces. And I think there's more the pleasure of, destroying the establishment through someone like Trump. I don't know.
Right. I mean, so, just again, referencing Dirk's remarks, many people go to a hockey game not to see a well played game. They go to see a fight, or they go to a car race, not to see a bunch of cars going around an oval track at high speed, but they want to see a crash. Many people go to a baseball game not to see a well-executed pitcher's duel. They want a sloppy game with a lot of home runs. Trump provides that kind of
I mean,
excitement.
our baseball games, people go to watch the sausage races and like the halftime entertainment. It's like
Yeah.
there's so much extra entertainment that's added around the game itself. It's just
Right. But the other half of what Dirk is saying, which I think is so important, is to recognize that crowd has always been there. And so Trump has riled them up and does a great job of keeping them engaged. But we have a lot of people who just are fed up with the Democrats' inability to provide any substantive policies that significantly improve their lives. So I just put together a few quick numbers here. But if we take a look at, and these are ones you're familiar with, but 24% of the black male electorate went for Trump. So these are not white deplorables. If we're talking about Latinos, the Democratic margin was cut in half in this election versus the last, plunging 14 points. If we're looking at the working class, a 4-point loss from 2020. If we take a look at women, those aged 18 to 29. In 2020, they voted for Biden by a significantly higher margin than they did for Kamala Harris, the person who was supposed to represent them, a black female. And of course, even larger gains among young men for Trump. So we see a lot of people that just didn't vote this time,
right.
that didn't last election. And then we saw a lot of these demographics, which supposedly were supposed to be the ones that were going to carry Kamala Harris to victory, who voted with, they either voted with their feet by not voting, or they decided to go into the polling place and vote for Trump. I mean, so the Democrats have a very big problem on their hands. And
yeah, I mean, I think you saw very little of the crossover to Trump. I mean, you saw some, but overall, Trump's numbers were down. I mean, this was still considered a very high turnout election.
It was a high turnout election. I mean, the last one was a record, of course.
Yeah. So there's a huge drop off from last year. I mean, and it's like, I guess when they first started talking about it, they were talking about it being like a 15 million vote drop off. And once all the votes get counted, it'll probably just be 10.
Right.
But still, a huge chunk of that came from the Democratic side. And
that's what explains the loss of the popular vote.
Yeah.
I mean, because of course, as we know, Donald Trump lost the popular vote both in 2016 and 2020. In one of those instances, he actually captured, of course, the presidency of the Electoral College, this inglorious institution, which is one which we are still suffering under. But this time, we don't have an excuse. Trump wins both the Electoral College and the popular vote. And it's the Democratic leaning voters, or at least those demographics that in the past we would have categorized as Democratic leaning, that didn't come out to vote in the same numbers that they did in the past. They were not provided with a strong, compelling argument. And even though Trump did not get quite as many votes as he did last time, he did relatively okay compared to the Democrats. He didn't see the same degree of drop off, but he captured again vote share among all demographic by age deciles, starting from 18 and going all the way up to 59. It was actually the voters that are supposed to be Trump supporters that, in other words, white folks that are over 59 that are sitting in their recliner and drinking cheap booze and watching Fox on television, that actually swithed more to the Democrats. That was the only
They feared the loss of their Social Security.
And they should be concerned about that. Not so much in the short term, but for anyone under 60, they should be alarmed by some of the things that Trump is talking about. Even though
I'm still under 60.
I'm not.
But some of the other things I think were things like they actually, on the Trump side, went out looking for voters with specific things. And I believe you wrote about this. Whereas the Harris side, they had a lot of Hollywood people or music
celebrities.
Yeah.
Right. All the people that you think are producing culturally weak products are that you see as consumables that you actually really don't like. I mean, I absolutely agree that that's a problem. But to be more clear regarding what I wrote, what I suggested a month and a half ago was that the Trump campaign was out hustling the Democrats. They were working harder and smarter. They had better people in terms of effectiveness in their campaign, and they began doing things like identifying groups of people, niche groups perhaps, but ones which could add to their sum total of votes through just very, very smart polling and engaging of different people to discover what they wanted. So early on, it was saying that we're not going to tax tips. That's huge for working people. I mean, many people work, and the chief part of their income comes through tips, whether they're Uber or Lyft drivers, waiters, bartenders, many people working within the service sector. That's where they get the
OnlyFans.
so that's a way to really boost their incomes, to say that you're not going to tax Social Security, to say if you're an American living abroad, and there's something like 3 million of them working abroad, you're not going to double tax them. If they're paying taxes in whatever country they're working in abroad, they're not going to tax them at home. Those people actually will go to their embassies or send in a mail-in ballot and vote. These things were really big, so they were delivering real things. And then, of course,
I had a friend who was paying taxes on tips in 2 countries.
Oh, yeah, sure. Double taxation has been something that expats have been complaining about forever. And so they were very clever just in picking up on what people were talking about in terms of what aggravated them and bringing them in. But there's another dimension to this, and that is that when the Harris campaign would rejoin with their own ideas, it was always about starting some new government program. I'm a big fan of government programs when they're well executed and planned. But I think for a lot of people, they're kind of tired of government programs because they think they're really not that effective. And when they hear the words government program, what they hear is, I'm going to be paying for somebody else. Whereas if you're giving somebody a tax break, even though that can be the same thing, because it's just the other side of the ledger in terms of the revenue, if you cut taxes, you're going to have to raise more revenue, and that means you're going to have to eventually get more money from somebody else somehow. But nonetheless, people hear it differently.
Mm-hmm.
They think that they're getting something that they deserve. They're getting more money, and this is something that is just candy for them. So the Trump people have, I guess they have learned and perfected and further developed the rhetoric that we've seen from the Republicans since Proposition 13 in California in 1978, when they began to combat stagflation at that time with this very clever program of saying, no, it's not that businesses are not paying you enough. It's that government is taking too much of your money, and we're going to put a stop to that. Well, we see that reprised here with the Trump campaign. Very effectively done. I mean, I can only applaud the effort in terms of its cynicism and effectiveness, but I'm appalled that the Democrats haven't seen this coming and have not built their own border wall against it.
Or didn't react to it. I mean, did not find a way to counter it.
Well, it was interesting, of course, what we saw with Harris, with the taxes on tips being rescinded as an idea, was, I mean, what could she say? I would have done the same thing politically, even though I completely disagree with it as a policy measure. I would have said, me too, which is what she said. So that puts you in a very weak position when you just find yourself agreeing with the other candidate.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a couple things I'd like to say about the lack of Harris policies, but first, I want to circle back to Professor Hoyer, because I know he was trying to say something like 3 comments ago, and I just want to make sure we don't exclude him here.
But
Were you, Dirk? You were, I think, making a comment, and you might have gotten squeezed out. Do you remember?
no, I think our discussion went towards the cultural question, rhetorical questions. Maybe something that I mean, you have been talking a lot about the real issues now, economy and so on. Maybe what we can add is something that we were discussing also, like the other day with Jeff. It's a question that maybe also a lot of people are fed up of this progressive neoliberalism in its bigger shape, however you want to label it. I don't like the label Vogue or whatever, but I mean, like Nancy Fraser labeled it progressive neoliberalism. In Germany, Sarah Wagenknecht labeled it lifestyle leftism. But the very idea of like how a lot of the discourse is so extremely disconnected from the, daily realities of many voters, and how that created even a certain, I don't know, protest reaction. And I mean, even in academia, I think people, like in a private conversation, would also tell you that they are a bit fed up. They would maybe not say it in public. So that there's a discontent about a certain shift in discourse, especially on the left-hand side of the spectrum, away from exactly these hard facts that Jeff was just describing, the economy, towards some issues that are, yeah, rather lifestyle questions, also important questions. I mean, nobody would deny the importance of, of the issues in question, but maybe that there was too much focus on that.
So you're talking about things like you still have a fairly regressive economic policy, you still have war, but now you have like advertisements for I'm gay and I'm in the CIA, it's like the old cartoon where there's like you still have the bombs dropping, but now they've got rainbow flags on the side of the military
Yes.
aircraft that's dropping them.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that also, since you mentioned the bombing, the very idea how also global, I mean, in a lot of countries in the Western world, the attitude to war has shifted. Before it was, the conservatives, the right-wing people, the neocons who were in favor of war, and the leftists who were against it. Now, in some ways or the other, when it comes to the Ukraine war, at least also here in Europe, a lot of people who were formerly demonstrating against war, they are now asking to deliver weapons to Ukraine, and also on the left-hand side of the political spectrum. Yes, the whole question that as important as LGBTQ plus is, of course, it is still for majority of the people probably not the first and most important thing they think about when they wake up in the morning, and these questions obviously are there, and there's a huge contradiction.
If you're gay in Gaza, the bomb is still going to blow you up. So,
Yeah.
what's your critical issue here, right? Is it gay marriage, or is it not being killed tomorrow morning, right?
But even worse is that if you support gay marriage in principle, and we saw, roughly 2 decades ago, well, maybe say 15 years ago, Americans became far more tolerant and supportive of these communities, which was a good thing. And it happened kind of organically. It happened through, popular culture, etc. But when it became to be advanced as a matter of policy that was not complemented by advances in legislation that was also supporting the working class and the middle class, when the ledger became so unbalanced, then what I think we began to see was somewhat of a loss of support for those communities. So it almost had the reverse effect, rather than advancing the rights of those populations and support for them, which is something that I think the four of us, of course, all do. But we began to see a dilution of that as people became frustrated, working people became frustrated and said, we're not getting anything for ourselves. And all we're getting are these policies which are protecting a minority of our populations, but not doing anything for the rest of us.
The other thing I think is that it became so focused on the wording and how you had to say it, and people were getting,
Language police.
yeah.
Yeah, no, at times it became a parody of the Khmer Rouge or the Cultural Revolution, where you had to have the right slogans, and I'm for, again, all of the underlying issues that we're referencing here, but the style in which it was done was beginning to irritate people. Now, some might say, well, who cares if you're irritated because we have a very important cause to advance? I agree, we have a very important cause to advance, but if you're irritating people, you're going to lose them politically, and you're not going to advance your cause. That's why it's important not to irritate them. I agree that the most important thing is to advance the cause, but not in a way which causes you to lose the support that's necessary to achieve that end.
I mean, there are times when that is the appropriate strategy. I mean, when the AIDS epidemic was raging in the 80s, you irritated a lot of people, but it was worth it. Now it's like, just look at this politically, and you just see this huge negative balance sheet. But we were in the middle of something, I think.
I guess that's the issue. I mean, are you raising consciousness or not? I mean, that's ultimately balance sheet that we need to be looking at and determine whether or not we're doing it or not. Sometimes you're right. Sometimes a messy protest is necessary to raise consciousness. At other times, it doesn't work. So we always have to calibrate and measure.
I mean, yeah, so much of this is just, it's not about absolutes. It's just about decent strategy and trying to do what will work.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And where are progressive politics working right now? Well, they're working with Morena in Mexico, right? With Claudia Sheinbaum and others that are advancing policy agendas which are receiving a lot of political support and carrying them into office with substantial majorities. I mean, so we have some instructive examples of what we should be doing, and they should be studied, one would think.
And the Democrats weren't doing that. They had last election and the election before, both times pushed out progressive Democrats in the, Bernie Sanders and others, and had kind of pushed them to the side. And you couldn't even begin to have anyone speaking about that this election because there wasn't even any room to do it.
Let me just throw out a few things really quickly here in terms of the Harris campaign style, right? One is, first of all, she got the position after Biden's illness was concealed for years, and she had to be kind of rapidly replaced, not when the people wanted it, but when the donors wanted it. And so you had this, you didn't have any sort of really open process, no primaries to find a new candidate, that she was just sort of imposed. So you started out from that completely undemocratic, and she was a person who had low ratings at the beginning. She moved up, but it was the team she had behind her was Biden's team, which had given him a 38% popularity rating. And then you had this weird, up goes the website, and it's, you can donate here. And I looked at that website for the first couple of weeks. There was not a single place where you could go to find any sort of policy or any statement at all of even just a slogan of what she stood for. It didn't even say stop Trump, I don't even think. It was just Kamala Harris, donate here. And there was actually articles, I don't know if it was in Politico or The Hill, that said she doesn't need to have policy positions. Sometimes it's better not to have any. And I'm like, what is going on here? And
most basically what was going on was that the Democratic Party thinks that it just needs to raise lots of money. It needs to outspend the Republicans, which that actually cost them the election in 2016. That doesn't guarantee you it. You get that money by addressing these cultural issues.
They massively outspent the Republicans this time. Even they add all this, the side money was still double. But then
they expect the volunteers to go out and bail them out, to get out the vote people. They just dump on them. It's disgusting.
They put so much. I mean, look, we were looking at the literature that we'd get at our house here, right? We're in a mostly black neighborhood, and so there was lots of literature directed at black voters, and she had an agenda for black men that she announced that I was discussing with people on social media, and we were kind of rating it and how kind of vacuous it was, and how she's going to support this, and there's going to be an initiative here, and it's none of it really commits her to do anything substantial, right? But there's a 5-point program. We got the literature coming into this neighborhood. None of that was on there, right? That entire program was skipped. They didn't even put it on the literature. They didn't have anything to put on the literature that they were spending millions to send to people. It was big pictures of Harris and a couple of points that were incredibly vague. We're going to fight inflation. It's you're going to fight. You're in office now.
Yeah.
And you can't spend tons of money to get out a message, then decide not to have a message. I couldn't understand what was happening in this campaign. And you still have people right now that are on social media that are talking about, well, it's evident that they wanted to lose because they don't care. The Democrats raise more money with a Trump in office than they do with a Democrat in office. And it's I don't know what to think, because it was such a bad campaign, and there's just like you had in 2016, there's a complete failure to reckon afterwards. I mean, 2016 was like they were blaming Russia. They're still blaming Russia this time. Jill Stein got 0.4% of the vote in this state, and they're blaming Jill Stein. And in 2016, they blamed Susan Sarandon for some reason, and they're still blaming her now.
Well, in contrast, Gary, to the United States, where the Greens are a party of arguably principle. In Germany, which Dirk can discuss,
God.
they are the liberal interventionists, and the people who have abandoned their once working class policies. I mean, Dirk, how much connection do you see between
I'm
the liberal
constantly online
Greens
trying to explain to Europeans that our Greens are not the same, and explain to Americans that their Greens aren't the same. They have the same name. I don't know what historical connections they have, but they are completely opposite parties now.
Maybe to come to what you referenced about the campaign, and to make a bridge to Europe. In some ways or the other, when Keir Starmer in the UK, they also reproached him that his campaign didn't have any substance. I mean, yet he was elected prime minister, and he avoided very carefully to make any kind of claims that could offend voters. So the question is, of course, whether that was an inspiration. I mean, these vibe policies were obviously also made by Obama, but of course with a much stronger charismatic appeal to it. You mentioned in the very beginning that the whole thing was a vibe. So Kamala Harris didn't deliver on the content. She also probably didn't deliver on the vibe. In that regard,
Kamala Harris was the wrong candidate to rely entirely on her charisma.
Which, yeah, yes. But I mean, anyway, in the case of the UK, it worked, but partially also because the Conservative Party has wrecked the country for such a long time.
And they lacked a good candidate.
Yeah, and it
was a low turnout election.
Yeah, so that was almost. I mean, for Labour Party, I mean, you could. It was unlosable.
Yeah, Starmer wins with far less votes than Jerry Corbyn received when he lost.
Yeah. So, but the question of the substance obviously is one. But I mean, by the way, something in Germany during the times of Angela Merkel, she avoided also very carefully to make any kind of like policy promises, and she kept it all very vague. But that is now breaking open. I mean, not only in Germany but all over. The idea that you can just, campaign with some kind of like very vague claims, and that the policy projects are not clear. And I think, I mean, in all honesty, I do not believe even that the Democrats actually have a policy project.
It isn't a good sales point for Western liberal democracy around the rest of the world when you have a campaign and you don't know what either candidate stands for, and you're supposed to vote based on like what they look like or what they sound like. I mean, it's just. I'm sure to people outside of this sphere where they're kind of be getting more and more accustomed to this, it seems like, wait, you want us to do what with our elections? I mean, we send people to all over the global South to tell them how to do liberal democratic types of elections, and like this is the model that we present to the rest of the world, and I'm sure it looks crazy to all these people.
It does look crazy, also from a European perspective, even just to see that the best candidates you can find in a country like the USA are Trump. It's not a very good advertisement for American politics. I mean, not that in Europe there would be any brilliant politicians, so we're certainly also not spoiled. But I think the idea was that. It was a bit of a disappointment.
Right. Yes. Gary, for those of us our age in the United States, this would be like Detroit in the 1970s saying that we are going to save the U.S. automobile industry by introducing the Pinto and the Vega. I mean,
Our family owned a Pinto.
Well, I'm glad to know that you survived. And
yeah, right.
The gas tank did not explode.
Yes. It had a problem. If you got rear-ended, it would explode. So we never got rear-ended though, so that was good.
What can we say as far as the policies that this might lead to? I'm thinking in the foreign policy aspect. This election. What can we? I don't want to say hope for. What can we either hope for or dread?
Well, I think there is some greater chance that the war in Ukraine will conclude faster under Trump. There's no guarantee of that. I
Well,
think unfortunately there is maybe even a greater chance that conflict with China will be increased over and above what it would be with the Democrats, even though they were quite invested in challenging China. Dirk, what do you think about Germany and Ukraine, or Europe and Ukraine generally? Do you see any shifts potentially occurring there, or is it still full on support the war effort in any way we can, etc.?
I mean, the German government also broke down basically the day after Donald Trump was elected. There was no connection, but I think in the consensus in Germany is still, even by the way, on the former pacifist Green Party, to unconditionally support Ukraine. The Conservative Party wants to do it. The Social Democrats want to do it. The Green Party, and then so the very idea is that there has been also a shift because the Social Democrats have been traditionally very Russia friendly, and former Social Democrat Chancellor Schröder was even today he's a friend of Putin's long after. I mean, but so there is nobody in Germany, at least none of the bigger parties, that would advocate a change in Ukraine policy, which is like unconditional support. The fact that Trump is most likely going to change the direction, and I think in that regard, I would even exceptionally agree with him that there has to be some form of negotiation to finish this war.
If I can just interject very quickly, I think the change in direction is thus with Trump, possibly. It's not that we're going to see the Ukrainians undercut. I mean, I think they are arguably losing the war, and that there is not enough manufacturing capacity to supply them with what they need, and they don't have enough soldiers. I think what Trump is going to do is, because of the people advising him, take a more or less realist assessment of this and change policy course. I don't think it has anything to do with being able to, in principle, continue supporting, let me say more importantly, sustaining this war. I don't think it's sustainable. In as much as I don't like the fact that we have this war at all.
I also don't think it's sustainable, although of course, in Eastern Europe, the former, post-Soviet state, Baltic states and Poland and so on, they are obviously radically in favor of continuing. In France, Macron has already tried at an earlier moment to put to develop an initiative, but it wasn't accepted on a global level. The NATO is obviously arguably more on the side of continuing, because in some ways or the other, this conflict gives a new lifeblood to an alliance that was already in a state of decomposition before the whole conflict started. So it's a very complicated setup, but I think there's nobody, at least here in Europe, who would actively vouch for negotiations. I mean, there's shy attempts here, but the overall tendency is to keep supporting the Ukraine unconditionally.
The means to do so is diminishing quickly.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of talk prior to the election of trying to Trump-proof Europe to make sure that the policy can continue. But let me throw out 3 data points, which I know is going to be a little messy, but here they are. Number one, you've got NATO Secretary General reportedly saying, that this is going to continue, and if the U.S. tries to undercut us, then we'll throw the U.S. out of NATO, which is ridiculous. You can't do that, and you can't. In the U.S., obviously, that's ridiculous. Another point is you had recently Thierry Breton on French television talking about how, with Trump's election, suddenly now things that you could not say publicly, right, are being said now in terms of doubting the course of the Ukraine war and being more supportive of negotiations. And, this there's just, he commented about, there's this discussion going on and say, well, we can say this now because we have a freedom to say what we couldn't say before, because now Trump has been elected and people see, Biden administration is going out the side, and now those forces that kind of did want a change of policy are now going to be able to be more outspoken. And the third data point is that some MAGA people have already claimed credit that Trump has ended the war in Ukraine because they point to Vladimir Putin reiterating statements that he's made over and over and over again about his willingness to engage in negotiations that are under the appropriate circumstances. So they've already ended the Ukraine war. We're just waiting for that to be like enacted on the ground.
Well, I mean, the
You're all
question,
stunned.
no, I mean, the question will be how, I mean, in some ways or the other, he will face resistance here in Europe. I mean, if he would make a peace deal that looks too much like a Ukrainian capitulation. And the question is, how much is he able to overrule that? And how much can, the Trump administration create facts on the ground by simply not delivering weapons or cutting the money supply that makes these things unavoidable? So Trump, who's so proud of himself as somebody who can cut deals, question is if he can cut a deal. And I think ultimately also you spoke about a historical moment. I think it might reveal ultimately the weakness of Europe also, that if in the end Trump decides together with Putin to end this war and Europe has to follow the lead, it would basically make it quite obvious that the European Union, not Europe, the European Union as a political player is very, very weak. Because they have aligned with the United States at the very moment when the war started. And now, so ultimately it would say like, okay, the decisions are not made in Brussels, the headquarters of the European Union, but they're made in Washington, and Brussels follows the lead, ultimately visible to everybody.
Right, and we've had like ambassadors to the European Union tell us that that they're just wasting their breath. That they shouldn't be sending them to Europe. If they really want to influence European policy, they need to send them to Washington, where European policy gets made.
It does seem that Trump would like to end it before he gets into office or shortly thereafter, in order to be able to use possibly the resources and maybe even military for another fight, whether that is Israel and Gaza, Lebanon, or Iran, or whether it is with China.
Well, the Trump faction of the Republican Party, which is becoming dominant, I mean, they're fully focused on China. They don't want to get engaged in a war in the Middle East. The older faction of the Republican Party, which is still very powerful, does. I mean, they've been jonesing for a war with Iran since, well, for the past 4 decades. And so they will try and engineer that. They failed last time. Trump took John Bolton into his cabinet, and then he just enjoyed humiliating him by at every opportunity, curbing him like an ill-behaved dog.
Right. So he's talking about I had to fire him because the guy is just nuts. Yeah.
So you had two different kinds of nuts together, Trump and Bolton, just a very different style.
I mean, yeah, no, it's like the Democratic campaign is like rushing to have like the Bolton people on their side and show around their endorsement. It's like this is one where Trump is right. Bolton is certifiable.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. But the thing that the Democrats, speaking cynically, the thing that the Democrats can do, I mean, I think we're in agreement that Ukraine can't win this war again because of insufficient numbers of people and material to fight it. But this is going to allow the Democrats to place the blame on the Republicans. They're going to say they sold them out, et cetera, et cetera. It's not going to be that they couldn't win the war because, as we know, the Pentagon had given its assessments of the situation. They said 6 to 12 months at maximum.
Same reason we lost Vietnam. It wasn't lack of resources, it was lack of will. It's like it's always lack of will. Someone politically backs out, and it's like the U.S. can win any war we want to. The only reason we've ever lost a war is because we backed out after maybe after 20 years we backed out. But we're just on the verge of victory on year 21.
That's exactly what they're going to do. Except this time it's not going to be the Democrats. They're going to be the fall guys. It'll be the Republicans.
Yeah. So, but the question is where Europe goes now. And this is what Leo was getting at was, the U.S. is going to have this very aggressive policy towards China. It has already had a very aggressive policy towards China. It's just been too divided in like wanting to attack everybody at once to focus. And now you've got Trump will be much more focused on China. And China is saying, well, will Europe just go along and be lapdogs for yet one more conflict? Or will they actually like say, no, we've got our own interests. We're not going to like harden everything against China. And I guess there's some talk that there's already been a pre-approved deal beforehand that, here's what they're going to do against China. So, I mean, I don't even know where that's going. But I think that's an important question.
I mean, the question is also
Do you have
in
something
Europe.
on that?
Sorry?
Professor Hoyer, do you have something on that? Have you heard anything on, what Europe might be doing with China?
There are of course bigger tendencies. I mean, for example, there are also in the European Union a lot of politicians who have a very strong transatlantic link, meaning who are very influenceable by whatever directions the United States are taking. I think in many regards there's also in Germany on another level like a recognition that it's against any vital interest to get engaged in a conflict with China. Because as a market, it's too important. And in that regard, Germany kept doing what they used to do before with Russia, meaning keeping a somewhere intermediary position. I mean, the German politics shifted, and that was really literally like quite a radical change, with the beginning of the Ukraine war towards being anti-Russian, cutting the ties. Whereas previously it was obviously an intermediator, firmly anchored in the Atlantic, in the Atlantic connection, and at the same time open to Russia. That is still the policy that Germany has towards China, meaning that actually, despite the obvious problems, they are not there. I mean, in majority, they're refusing to take a too strong stance against China.
And in this case, there's no pipeline they can blow up.
Yeah, no, I mean, so and I think in France, I would say it's maybe less strong, but I do believe that the vital interests are too strong to get involved in an American intervention there somewhere in China. I personally do not believe at the very moment that the majority of the powerful politicians here would go in that direction.
Do you have any things that you'd recommend us to read, to look at?
Maybe a recommendation about Russia. It's made by a British documentary filmmaker called Adam Curtis, and it's basically like based on archive material that the BBC produced in Russia between after Gorbachev came to power up to the moment shortly before Putin came to power, and he edited that to a 6 or 7 hour series called Trauma Zone, which I think is a great way to understand some of the Russian mentality and how the 90s transition affected maybe also the way of thinking until today, and possibly also why Putin is still in such a powerful place. I mean, again, the series finishes officially with Putin's presidency, but I think for a deeper understanding of Russia, that is a very good program.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Good day to you.
Well, thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.